Let's break the political talk show mold. Anything worth doing is hard, and that includes being a good citizen. Our mission is to help you be that better citizen by letting you hear about stuff you might not know, which will make everyone think you're so smart, or by giving you a chance to listen to interviews and debates on a wide variety of subjects that might actually allow you to form new opinions in the privacy of your own mind. I'm Justin Oldham, and you are listening to the Politics and Patriotism Show here on the Stitcher Smart Radio Network. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another historical edition of the Politics and Patriotism Show. In this one-hour episode, I'm going to be bringing you a conversation that I had with author and historian Thomas Fleming. We'll be discussing the background behind his 2013 book, A Disease in the Public Mind. This is an examination of the root causes involving the American Civil War. Why did we fight this conflict? Why do we think we fight this conflict? And why did we really do it? That's what we're actually going to get into. The root causes of just about any war you'd care to name are of particular interest to me because they touch a civic nerve. And, truth be told, we don't always understand why we send our sons and daughters off to fight. A case in point would be the American Civil War, circa 1861 to 1865. You may think you know this conflict inside and out, but as you're about to hear, there are some things attached to this war that you may not be as familiar with as you think you are. So please get comfortable, turn on your favorite internet surfing device so that you can Google some of the things you're about to hear, and if you get a chance, please look up thomasflemingwriter.com. And since we're talking about the American Civil War, let's kick it off with a little bit of propaganda music from the period. You may recognize this tune. And by the way, this is Thomas Fleming talking about his 2013 book, A Disease in the Public Mind, published by Da Capo Press.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
My name is Tom Fleming, or my literary name is Thomas Fleming. And I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, and I used to look out the window of my boyhood bedroom, and I saw the Statue of Liberty. But various people pointed out that the Statue of Liberty had her back turned to New Jersey. This, of course, sums up, in a way, our feeling that New York was this huge entity across the river, and we all wanted to become part of it. And I have managed to do that. I married a very beautiful girl from Yonkers. And that's, for those who don't know the geography, that's north of New York. And I was just a little south and east of New York. And so, south and west of New York, I mean. And so we met in the middle. And we've been living in New York for the last 50-some years. I always wanted to be a writer, and I was encouraged to do it by some of my teachers in school, for which I'm enormously grateful. And I started out thinking, how do you write a book? I just couldn't imagine it because, you know, most people in high school and college only write term papers. That's the longest thing they write. I was very lucky. I got a job with a man who had 34 books on his escutcheon on his shelf there, and his name was Fulton Houser, and he'd had many bestsellers and so forth. And I said to him, how do you write a book, Fulton? And he said, Tom, if you looked at everything you ate in a year piled up in one place, you couldn't stand it. You'd get sick, but you don't. You eat it every day. That's how you write a book, 4 pages a day. This was like a light bulb going on in my brain, and it's never gone out. The idea, as Fulton put it, is you write every day, whether you're hungover, you're sick, you're this, you're that, tired, and so forth. You keep writing the book that you're working on. And at the end of a say 8 or 9 months, you've got a manuscript, and then comes the really tough job. You start rewriting it, and that's how I became a writer. But again, I didn't realize that there were many elements in the life of a writer, and one of them was surprise, the discovery of something that you just didn't expect. And I was working for a magazine, and I was writing a feature called "The Day It Happened." We were looking for events that happened all in one day, and I came across the Battle of Bunker Hill, and that did indeed happen in one day. And I went up to Boston to do research on it, and I found that this was in 1960. No one had written a book on the Battle of Bunker Hill in 90 years, and that was like another light bulb coming on in my mind, because I saw all sorts of aspects of the battle that were in the research libraries that most people had missed in the 90 years ago. And I wrote this book. It's called "Now We Are Enemies." And that was a comment by Benjamin Franklin after the battle was over. And it was like saying, "Okay, pal, we're at war." And that's all there is to it. He wrote it to a friend in the British Parliament. And that book was a tremendous success. It surprised everyone. It was condensed in the Reader's Digest, which meant it got 40 million readers. It was a main selection of the Literary Guild, which meant a huge number of sales there, too. It was reviewed in over 70 newspapers. It was the front page of the Chicago Tribune Review. And so that's how I got going as a writer. I just feel that there was some sort of divine providence involved in the whole thing. And when I say that, I'm quoting George Washington. He was very convinced that providence, as he didn't use the word divine very much, was part of everyone's experience. Certain things happened to us over which we had no control, and yet very often it was a blessing. And that's how I have begun. That's how I began writing, and from then I began to think that some of the material I found in my research was about fascinating individuals, and you couldn't write a whole book about one of them. So I began to see that perhaps historical novels would be another way of writing about our past. And my first big success in that field was a book called Liberty Tavern, which is still available. It's being sold now as an ebook, and that was set in a tavern in New Jersey on the King's Highway between Perth Amboy and Philadelphia, or between New York and Philadelphia, really. And it too was a very big success. It was called The Gone with the Wind of the American Revolution. And those two books got me going in writing both nonfiction history and writing historical novels, which try to bring you back into the history in a very personal way. You're deeply involved with these characters who are experiencing the history that you find in the history books.
Since you're on this topic, I have a question just as a writer myself. Since you brought this up, I just gotta ask. Because there was such a lack of material, and given the fact that you went on to make such large contributions in the field, I want to know, just from a historical perspective, what caused such a gulf? You would think that because there was such gold to be mined there, you would think that somebody else would have done it, and why didn't they?
And the answer to that, Justin, is the power of history to create events which sort of obliterate the events before us that have occurred in our past. And the big things that happened between the Revolution and in 1960, when I wrote Now We Are Enemies, were the Civil War, which was a huge historical experience of terrifying proportions in many ways, and then World War I and World War II. Both of these, all three of these, created thousands of books and thousands of readers, and the Revolution just sort of shrunk. and became a sort of shadow in the past. And people began to think, oh, those are guys, the founding fathers, Washington, they look good in a history book and so forth, but they weren't very interesting. They were kind of boring people. I remember getting a phone call from DeWitt Wallace, who was the publisher of the Reader's Digest, and I knew him personally, but this was such an amazing thing for him to say to me. After he'd read my book on Bunker Hill, which he bought to condense in the magazine, he said, I never realized that there were such interesting characters in the American Revolution. And DeWitt Wallace was one of the most intelligent men I ever met, and very well read. But it's a perfect example of how history tends to absorb the mind for whole decades, the history of a certain event. And I think that's the explanation for why the revolution sort of disappeared. And I have, if I may boast a little, have helped to bring it back into the American public mind, I like to use that phrase.
I think that's a very fair assessment. Now, just me being me, when I look around for things to write about, I look for what are people not doing. That's the first question in my mind, and then of course I want to know why. Why are they not doing that? Because maybe it's too hard. Maybe it is. Maybe it's too much the past. And my background in both history and political science leads me to the jaded conclusion, and I'm actually relating this to my segue into your book here. Popular events, as driven by the media, cause us to turn our back on these great historical figures because we get caught up in what you just said, the stuff going on in the public mind.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I'd like to add one element to that, Justin, and that is, in my experience, I always look for some idea that adds a new insight to this particular piece of the past that we're writing about. And I hope I've done it in this new book. But my first experience on this was I was writing a book on the year 1776. And incidentally, that's been republished as an ebook only a few weeks ago. And I had worked for about 3 years. I had file cabinets full of material on this great year, this crucial year in which our country was founded, and yet I didn't really have anything that pulled it together. And I was walking down to the beach on a summer day, and I suddenly got like a lightning flash in my head. 1776, year of illusions. And I saw this was the inner insight, the inner secret of this whole year, that at that time, the British and the Americans both started to fight this war with wrong ideas about how to win it. And so it leads us very quickly, I think, and I prove this in the book, I may say, and that is that I've tried to do that again and again in other books, and I think it leads directly to this new book, A Disease in the Public Mind, because the illusions that the generals and the politicians had in the beginning of 1776 are, at least that they can be compared to what I see as the diseases in the public mind that led to this terrible catastrophe that we call the Civil War.
I'd like to pause for a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Thomas Fleming about his new book, A Disease in the Public Mind. This is published courtesy of Da Capo Press, 2013.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
Now, as we prepare to talk about your book, I would like to remind the audience here to go to thomasflemingwriter.com so that they can have a look at the stuff you have there about this book while we talk about this. So let's get a little bit political science here for just a second here and set the stage. What is a disease in the public mind?
A disease, or a disease in the public mind. I have a chapter in the book in which I discuss a wide variety of diseases. It's a distortion of political reality. that enables people to become passionately involved in what they think is a great cause or a great fear, paranoia, you might almost say, that that threatens them in some way, or gives them the illusion that they're going to do something incredibly wonderful and important for their country. And these diseases have been traveling through the American public mind and the public minds of other countries for a long, long time. A good example of them from another period is the agitation that led to the 18th Amendment and Prohibition, which banned all alcoholic liquor and destroyed the seventh largest industry in the United States. This was rammed down the throats of Congress and the American people by a fanatic minority who thought that drinking liquor was a sin. It was an evil thing to do. And of course, they claimed it led to a lot of damage and heartbreak and so forth. That much was true. And there's quite a similarity between this and the idea that anybody who owned a slave was committing a terrible sin and deserved to be looked down on and despised and insulted if by any chance they were met in person. And so it's that sort of thing. These are, you have to call them obsessions, convictions that are enormously powerful, and they're backed by a media apparatus. What you said about the media, Justin, is so true. The power of the media over the public mind is just immense, and it always has been, all the way back to the Revolution and up in the run-up to the Civil War. It was hugely powerful, with so many newspapers on both sides flinging insults at each other and at the two sections of the country. So that is, if I may apologize slightly, as a quickie and rough but accurate disease of what a public mind is and what it can do.
Now, just in case we don't get to it later on, I want to mention it right now, because as soon as this program is uploaded to the internet, it will live forever, so it's got a certain degree of time capsule value.
I like that.
In the 20th century, post-American Civil War, in the 1950s, post-World War II period, we saw the Red Scare, and my father was a young man growing up. He finished high school and then went on to the military.
Yes.
And he has said many times since I graduated from high school, the very last thing I ever want to do is go back to that. And we've seen all kinds of movies from the period. As a matter of fact, you see some of the popular entertainment from the day begins with a 10-second blurb from the. It's got a government seal on it. We would like to thank the House Committee on Un-American Activities for giving their seal of approval to this movie, and we forget how easily we can slip into the very condition that you are talking about here. So I want to ask.
That's very true. And may I say too, Justin, that had a companion disease of the public mind, this fear of communism taking over the country, which was really fanciful, to put it mildly. But yet we had seen in Europe that it had taken over a lot of countries, and that the power of the media apparatus in those countries deluging the world with pro-communist and hatred of the pro-communism and hatred of the United States, that had a lot to do with feeding the Red Scare in America. So it very often these diseases of the public mind breed other diseases, and they duel back and forth, which is, I think, what happened in the Civil War.
Well, I agree. I would agree with that. Now, I was politically aware through the 1970s and the 1980s, and in 1984, there was a very popular movie that came out, Red Dawn, and it theorized a Soviet invasion of the United States. And
yes, I remember that. Yeah,
went on to be a blockbuster success, but
sure.
I remember the first few times I ever actually saw that movie, you could hear a pin drop in the theater because people were not there for the entertainment value. If they could have, if the lighting had been appropriate, they would have sat there to take notes.
I'm sure you're right. There's no doubt about it. And there's a parallel to that in World War One, Justin. About 3 years or 4 years before World War One, there was a novel published in England about a German invasion of England, and it was a huge bestseller, and it absolutely terrified everybody. And at this point, the Germans hadn't said boo about invading anybody, but it had this huge impact on the public mind of the British, and I think had a lot to do with luring them into World War One.
Now since you said that, let's get to the meat of this thing here. What lured us into the Civil War? So set the stage for that and go as far back as you like.
We inherited slavery as something that had been in the world for 2,000 years. And I always like to preface this sort of thing by reading a comment by the man who was really the hero of my book, Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln says, "I have no prejudice against the Southern people. They are just what we would be in their situation. If slavery did not now exist among them, they would not now introduce it. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not know how to do myself. If all the earthly power were given to me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution, slavery." It was a huge problem, and it just wouldn't go away. That's all. It couldn't go away, and it kept growing, both in the United States and in South America, particularly in Brazil and in Cuba, and in the British West Indies, where there was a huge slave population. And so, at first, there wasn't any great criticism of slavery. As I say, it had been around for 2,000 years. But more slowly, various people, particularly because there was a tradition of freedom in America, began to express their uneasiness about it. My favorite character in this respect is the Quaker, the New Jersey Quaker, John Woolman, who just he couldn't really explain why he didn't like slavery. He could only tell people it deeply disturbed his spirit. Quakers felt, very closely in communication with God, and that was the way he put it. And he traveled through the South as well as around the North, telling people, why can't we end this? Why can't we stop the slave trade? And this uneasiness with slavery began to manifest itself in other parts of America. And then Woolman went to England, and over there he also spoke about this. And of course, the British had created the slavery in the United States and in the West Indies. They had made millions of pounds from it, and so they thought this guy was an absolute weirdo. One prominent Quaker physician, when Woolman began to explain why he was in England, they'd come all the way from America, said, we know what's on your mind, but why don't you go home as quickly as possible? That was a contempt with which a fellow Quaker met Woolman with his call for the end of slavery. And what once Woolman explained in a very calm and not calm and no anger in his voice whatsoever. Once he explained why he was here and why he'd made the trip and why slavery troubled him so much, the same physician stood up and asked Woolman to forgive him. He wanted to apologize, and that was the power of this man. And his journal. He died in England of smallpox, very tragically. But the journal that he kept was reprinted dozens and dozens of times and became a huge influence in England that led another generation of Quakers to persuade British politicians to begin to abolish slavery in the West Indies by ending the slave trade. And finally, in 1834, they abolished slavery completely. But how they did it, Justin, is something that we should remember. They did it by paying the owners of these slaves the equivalent of $1 billion in our money. And that freed 850,000 black men and women in the West Indies with no bloodshed. And here was a tremendous lesson that we should have and could have learned. One of the great foes of slavery in the United States, William Lloyd Garrison, who founded what we call the abolition movement, he was in England when this happened. He was in Parliament soon after the vote. I think when the vote was taken, but he talked to the politicians right after it and so forth. He was so full of hatred for the South, Garrison was, that he couldn't dream of paying them any money for. He wanted slavery to be, all the slaves to be freed immediately with no compensation, and he didn't care if this led to a slave uprising of gigantic proportion. This was the difference between the American and the British approach. Garrison personified this hatred of the South. And in the book, I show how this hatred, this antagonism between the two sections preceded the argument over slavery. It began when Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, imposed an embargo on the trade of the United States. He stopped all commerce with Europe because he was afraid this would lead us into a war with England, they were seizing our merchantmen at sea. And this unbelievable decision on his part, it was just a unilateral presidential decision. It caused tremendous economic disaster in New England. And Garrison's father was one of the men he was a harbor master. He used to take ships in and out of their home port. He went bankrupt, and so did dozens of other merchants. And the New Englanders in particular, they suddenly began to see the Southerners as uncaring enemies, and that was one of the sources of this antagonism between the two sections that led to when Garrison began saying that the South was evil because they had slaves. That it added tremendously to the intensity of the passion with which the abolitionists pursued their cause.
Now, you have a great deal to say in your book about sectionalism, but I'd like you to hit the rewind for a moment and concentrate on Thomas Jefferson, because he got close to compensated emancipation, but his own built-in prejudices would not allow him to see the tree that was in the forest.
Oh, Justin, that is so true, and I'm so glad you've taken us around to this subject. In one of my chapters, I call Thomas Jefferson slavery's greatest foe and unintended friend. He was their greatest foe because he wrote the Declaration of Independence, which really is the statement that destroyed slavery in the United States ultimately. But he didn't think that blacks were equal to whites in intelligence, and he was absolutely convinced they had so many resentments against their white masters because of being enslaved that they would be very dangerous if they were freed. And he could never overcome this fear. And another reason for this fear was the fact that he played a part in one of the most terrible incidents that ever occurred in the New World between slaves and masters. He encouraged the French to invade the country that we now call Haiti. Back then it was called Saint-Domingue, and it was part of the island of Santo Domingo. And Jefferson wanted to see the French remove this black ruler, Toussaint Louverture, and he was actually, Louverture was an ex-slave who had won power in the upheaval after the French freed all the slaves in their colonies, and the French revolutionists, and Jefferson just couldn't believe that a black man could be that intelligent and actually run a country, and so he encouraged the French army to go into Haiti, and after a year of unbelievably savage civil war, the French army collapsed from yellow fever. They just couldn't deal with the climate, and they retreated, and that left a black army, an enraged black army, the only people standing with guns in their hands, and they marched across what we now call Haiti and killed every French white man, woman, and child. And this was what I call in the book Thomas Jefferson's nightmare, a a race war in which both sides kill the other simply because of the color of their skins, or they're in another era of the world because of their religion. A race war, though, is the worst, and it destroys one race or the other in a particular part of the world. And this, Jefferson forced, or persuaded rather, Congress to pass a resolution saying we would never recognize the independence of Haiti and would never allow any American contact with this country. And it was a terrible tragedy, and also it was a futile gesture because this fear of a race war had gone from being a nightmare in Jefferson's soul to a nightmare in the soul of the entire South. And we see in the book how this fear continued to grow over the next 50 years. And when John Brown, the man who raided Harper's Ferry in the hope of seizing weapons and starting a race war in the South, he was an apostle of abolitionism. When he did that, the Southerners said, these people, they meant the Northerners who had backed John Brown. There were 6 of them, 6 wealthy men. These people want to inflict another Santo Domingo on us. Imagine 58 years later, they were still thinking in terms of Thomas Jefferson's nightmare. It just shows the power of some diseases of the public mind in the souls of a whole region of the country.
What's fascinating to me, as in the chronology as you lay it out, is that even during the American Revolution, there are voices of reason who get shouted down. So I'd like you to talk about a few of those, and let's start with Colonel Lawrence, Colonel John Lawrence, because he's somebody that almost nobody knows about anymore. And the price he paid for his beliefs, I think, will surprise a lot of people.
John Lawrence is one of my favorite historical characters. He was handsome, really, and he was very intelligent. He had a law degree. He became an aide to General George Washington, and his father, meanwhile, became president of the Continental Congress. And for an added irony in the whole thing, his father had, before the revolution began, been the biggest and richest slave trader in South Carolina. But that did not, if anything, it accentuated Lawrence's detestation of slavery because he was an impassioned believer in the Declaration of Independence. And towards the end of the Revolution, he persuaded George Washington to approve the idea of raising a black brigade, 3,000 freed slaves who would fight as fellow members of the Revolutionary Army in South Carolina and defend the country against a British invasion. It was a brilliant and daring concept, and some people, Alexander Hamilton loved it. He was another aide of Washington's. He loved it so much that he got the Continental Congress to pass a bill saying that they would pay the money, they would pay the owners for a compensation. I believe it was about $1,000 for each of the slaves who were free to join this black battalion. And some member of the Continental Congress remarked, if this happens, this could be the beginning of the end of slavery in America. And that has led some historians to say this was John Lawrence's plan, was the first Emancipation Proclamation. And I use that as a title of this chapter in the book. But Lawrence, when he went down south, even with Washington's approval and the Continental Congress's approval, he could not persuade the government, the legislature of South Carolina, to approve raising these black soldiers. The fear of a race war was already very strong in South Carolina. They didn't need Thomas Jefferson's nightmare, which was born 30 years later in Haiti. They were already very, very upset. They'd had a couple of slave revolts, and they just wouldn't approve of it. So Lawrence thought the only way he could possibly succeed in persuading them was to do daring things on the battlefield. And he proceeded to risk his life. And the general in command down there, Nathaniel Greene, was beside himself. He knew Lawrence was going to get killed if he kept doing these things, but he didn't know how to stop him. And finally, Lawrence led 150 men of 150 of American soldiers in a headlong charge against about an equal number of British, and the British blasted the Americans down. It was like a Bunker Hill in reverse, and Lawrence went down with a bullet in the heart, and that was the end of his dream of the first Emancipation Proclamation. It's a heartbreaking story, but I found it very, very ennobling, very deeply moving, but also I was proud to think that there were Americans this early that were thinking in terms of ridding slavery by asking the black soldiers to prove their desire for liberty by fighting for them. And now I think we should definitely add, Justin, that another even more important gentleman also reached this conclusion. His name is George Washington. Don't you agree on that?
Well, yes. Now, tell the story about what Washington does, because I don't know of anybody who actually knows about it today, and it plays an important, pivotal role in your story.
Yes. I have, again, a surprising chapter title for Washington. I call him The Forgotten Emancipator. And I can already tell you from the many letters I received for the book, this really surprised a lot of people and delighted them when they read the chapter. Washington, very early in the Revolution, when he took over the army in Massachusetts in 1775, a lot of black soldiers came to him they had fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and they wanted to join the army. And at first, Washington, being a slave owner, he was a little uneasy about it. But the more he talked to these men, the more he began to think, I think we ought to allow them in the army. They were free blacks. And so he started to enlist free blacks. Pretty soon, some other people in Rhode Island raised a whole black regiment. And by the end of by 1781, when the Battle of Yorktown more or less ended the war, the fighting war in the Revolution, 1 in every 7 men in the ranks of the American army were black. And 1 in every 7 was black, I should say, to correct my bad English. And this was a remarkable tribute to Washington's. He was, as far as racial prejudice concerned, he just didn't have it, and that was derived from his friendship with another wonderful character, the Marquis de Lafayette. He was only 20 years old when he got to America. He was the richest. Probably the richest Frenchman in France, and he came over here to volunteer to fight for liberty, for the American liberty, against the British, whom he hated, of course. And but as he fought and thought about America, he began to be very upset at the fact that we weren't getting rid of slavery. And he said to Washington, "I never would have drawn my sword if I thought I was founding a republic of slavery." And this had a huge impact on Washington. And he started treating the blacks at Mount Vernon as almost as if they were free people. He made some of them overseers of his outlying farms, and he gave them extra rewards when they did a good job. He recognized slave marriages, so he would never sell a man or a wife if indeed he was forced to sell them, which he never was. But he said this, and when he became president, after the Revolution ended, there was twice while he was president, he considered freeing all his slaves at Mount Vernon and calling on other slave owners to do the same thing. And this would have been another Emancipation Proclamation. But unfortunately, as president, he was involved in a huge brawl with Thomas Jefferson about recognizing and participating in the French Revolution. Jefferson wanted us to get into a war with England over on the side of the French revolutionaries, and Washington saw that would destroy the American economy, and he didn't really feel we were obligated to do it. He'd had enough of war, so he refused. But the anger and rage that swirled through America over this made him very reluctant to put slavery into the public mind as another issue. And so he never did say this while he was president. But after he left the presidency, he wrote his will. And in his will, he freed every one of his slaves. And the most impressive thing about this will, which is wonderful, it's a 23-page document, and it's wonderful to read because he recognized each slave individually, and he understood what training might enable him to earn a living, and he insisted that each one of these black men and women would be taught to read and write. It was an amazing sign of a white slave owner recognizing the humanity of blacks and the equality of them in his own handwriting, you might say. But what happened here was another tragedy, I'm afraid. When Washington died, he died very suddenly. Nobody even had an idea that he was ill. He had an infection in his throat, and it caused him made it very, very difficult for him to breathe. And he died at the end of the day. And the shock of his death, after him being the leader of the country for 30 years, was so staggering that nobody even noticed that he freed his slaves. And so the second Emancipation Proclamation was also pretty much ignored by the public at large. In fact, William Lloyd Garrison knew so little about Washington freeing his slaves that at one point in his raging attacks on slavery in the South, he thought that the federal government should change the name of the capital from Washington, because Washington had been a slave owner and he was writhing in the flames of hell, as Garrison said, because of this terrible sin. So it shows the extreme that to which the abolitionists took things in the years, the early years of the 19th century, leading up to the Civil War.
As a writer of fiction, I look at the historical irony involved in Washington's situation, and I'm reminded of the old joke that no good deed goes unpunished. And
very good. That's very good. Yes.
As much of a transformation as he achieved, he dies in the shadow of the Custis curse.
Yes.
So, would you talk about that?
The Custis curse was his. They loved slavery. Martha Washington did not agree with what George did, and neither did any her surviving children and grandchildren. Well, the children were all dead by the time Washington died, but her grandchildren, they did not believe that the slaves should be freed, and they didn't for a long, long time. Only one, his great grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, he did free his slaves in 1858, so there wasn't any, even in Washington's own family, there wasn't any evidence that he was able to persuade his own relatives of the need to do this thing, and that adds to the tragedy, I think, of Washington as I call him the forgotten emancipator.
I find that as much as these emancipators are noble, they still stand on quite the mound of hypocrisy, because as you get closer and closer to the eve of the Civil War, you have people like Harriet Beecher Stowe and those in her circle who are championing the emancipation, and yet they think so very little of the people that they want to free.
That's another tragic side of the abolitionists. They didn't really recognize the Negro as an equal human being. Some of them did. I don't want to blacken all their reputations or anything like that, but a great many people didn't. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, was definitely of that group. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin and created this character, Uncle Tom. And to this day, in our own time, if a black person wants to insult another black person, he'll I'm speaking of between men, he'll call him an Uncle Tom, a yes man, who'll do anything that a white man tells him to do. That her character, she thought of blacks as rather childish and simple-minded, and that's how she created Uncle Tom. But in the book, I have another character which totally contradicts this portrait, and I call him the real Uncle Tom. And as a matter of fact, he did. Harriet Beecher Stowe read his autobiography, and And she admitted that she learned a great deal from that, but she didn't endow Uncle Tom with the intelligence that the real Uncle Tom had. His name was Josiah Henson, and he was born a slave in Maryland. He was a very bright man. Pretty soon he became the overseer of his master's plantation. He made more money for his master than any other white overseer ever made. And I go on to say in this chapter that he was not an exception. That even in the evil institution of slavery, hampered by so many things, 70% of the plantations in the South were run by black overseers who did really great work. And they were proving that they were intelligent leaders, black men with leadership abilities, way back in the middle of this nightmare that they were going through. And I think I consider this chapter one of the most important chapters in the book, the realization that these black men were proving, in spite of slavery, being surrounded by slavery, that they deserve to be free. And I think also I try to show in this chapter that slavery was changing. Some slave owners had begun to pay their slaves extra money if they worked especially hard, particularly if they were growing crops like tobacco and indigo, and required special skills. So there's a whole side of that, which again the abolitionists were blind to. They wanted to believe that slavery degraded the South, that the blacks were all stupid and the whites were all just a bunch of full-time rapists. They compared them to Sodom and Gomorrah. The unbelievable things they said about the South. It was the great dragon of the Book of Revelations that was going to devour freedom in the North, just as it had devoured in the South. It got down to something as simple as this. There's a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, and he shouted to a crowd in Boston, "It comes down to this. Are you for slavery or for freedom? Are you for God or the devil?" Now, there was the quintessential expression of the abolitionist disease in the public mind.
I'd like to pause for the last commercial break of this episode, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this discussion with author and historian Thomas Fleming, who's talking about his latest book, A Disease in the Public Mind. This is published in 2013.
You are listening to another Politics and Patriotism podcast. Find us online through iTunes.
With this backdrop on the table here, let's go into the final phases of the program here and take a look at Abraham Lincoln, who comes completely full circle. As he begins his political career, he starts out thinking one way, and then he finishes being the great emancipator. So how does he achieve that transformation in such a heated environment?
Lincoln learned from experience, but he also learned from reading and from history. One of the most important books he read was a book by a Massachusetts man about the history of the blacks in the Revolution. And this book was a revelation to him. He saw that blacks could serve in a war and fight bravely for a cause, and this had a lot to do with changing his mind about black abilities, and he also was very impressed when he learned of the British emancipation, what they call compensated emancipation, and more he began to see that the key to peace, if there was going to be peace between the North and the South, would be to persuade the Southerners to accept a gradual elimination of slavery, freeing different generations of slaves over the course of the next 40 years, and paying their owners a very large amount of money. It was going to probably cost about $4 billion to free these people peacefully. But by doing it gradually like that, there would have been less antagonism, less fear of a race war between the blacks and the whites. That was Lincoln's so you might say, unknown solution to slavery. But the fear of a race war was so huge in the Southern mind that he never got anywhere. He tried, when he first took office, he spent weeks trying to persuade the slave-owning states that had not seceded, Kentucky and Delaware and Maryland and Tennessee. He tried to persuade their representatives to accept compensated emancipation and show that it worked to begin the whole process. And he couldn't get them to do it. Even these people could not be persuaded, even though they would have had some help from the Union Army in their midst and so forth to keep the peace. But it showed the incredible difficulty that these two conflicting people, that these two conflicting views, the antagonisms, the two diseases, and the man that personifies this, Justin, is a man who was, I think, the second most important character in my book, Colonel Robert E. Lee. And here we get to what I call the greatest what if, the greatest turning point in American history. Robert E. Lee in 1859 and 1860 was the most famous soldier in the country. He had won fame in the Mexican War as the right-hand man of the commanding general, Winfield Scott. And now Winfield Scott was the commander of the American Army, and he persuaded Lincoln, he and other people persuaded Lincoln to offer Robert E. Lee command of the Union Army that Lincoln summoned to put down the rebellion. Just I have I write for a something on the internet, a website on the internet called History News Network, and I did an essay last week. You can find it on there by just going on hnn.us. And it was, what if Robert E. Lee had accepted command of the Union Army? Would there have been a civil war of the same terrible proportions that ended up killing 1 million men? Would we be the only country in the world that fought such a war? I say in this what if that we historians call it counterfactual history. I say no, and I show how Lee's ability as a general and his symbolic power, that people thought of him as George Washington's heir. He was married to George Washington's great-granddaughter. So it was a huge moment in American history. But Lee, after agonizing over it for a while, finally said no. The abolitionists had attacked him personally because his wife owned slaves, and accused him of stripping a black woman and lashing her personally, something that never happened. And he couldn't bring himself to think of commanding a Union Army that he thought would be full of people who hated Southerners because they owned slaves. And so he turned down Lincoln's offer and resigned from the Union Army. And this, I think, is one of the least known facts in American history, but it illuminates so much of what we've been talking about in the book.
One of the things that I particularly like that you point out is the fact that you're able to draw on such recent research. So as we go into the final minutes, if you would, I'd like you to put on your scholar's hat and talk about some of the more recent research that you've been able to dip into, because 100, 200 years from now, when people are listening to this very ancient audio recording, I'm sure that the academic side of what you've done here may be of interest to them. And as I'm looking behind me here in my office at my bookshelf, I do have to admit, a lot of what we have, a lot of my favorites on the Civil War do happen to be rather dated. So as you put this together, what did you particularly like about the new source material, and what did it really help you do?
Again, thank you, Justin, because you give me an opportunity to tell my most electrifying discovery. I thought when I showed how Lincoln really wanted to free the slaves with compensated, and couldn't do it, and he finally wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, I thought that summed up the whole thing. But I found a book called Memories of Lincoln, which brought the whole idea of Lincoln as George Washington's heir into unbelievably vivid life. it's a totally forgotten little volume that was written originally in French in the 19th century and then published to no attention whatsoever in the 1950s when we weren't thinking too much about the Civil War. It was written by a man called the Marquis de Chambrun, and he was the Marquis de Lafayette's grandson. And he had the same charm that the Marquis de Lafayette had, and he hated slavery just like the Marquis did. And he had been sent over by the French government to try to repair the relationship between France and the Americans. And he was hugely popular with Mrs. Lincoln. He was, as I say, charming like his grandfather. And so he was a constant visitor to the White House, and Lincoln took a great fancy to him. And as the war was winding down, Lincoln invited him to join him and Mrs. Lincoln on a visit to the Union Army camp, which then led to a visit to the captured capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. The war was almost over, as I say, and Chambrun tells in there of Lincoln walking through the streets of Richmond, horrified at the terrible damage that's been caused, while black men and women are crying out their gratitude towards him. And I felt it deep in my soul that here was a moment when the Marquis de Lafayette and George Washington, the forgotten emancipator, were walking in step with the great emancipator, Lincoln. It was just tears rolled down my cheeks as I wrote these last pages in the book. And it ends with Lincoln riding back to Washington with Mary Lincoln and the Marquis de Chambrun, and Lincoln talks about the terrible damage he'd seen in Richmond, and he resolves he's going to heal the terrible wounds between the two sections. He's going to make his second term devoted to reconciliation. And Mary Lincoln looks at him in her hard-nosed or hard-eyed way, and she points to the Capitol, the dome of the Capitol in the distance, and she says, "You have enemies there that won't let you do that. They don't want a piece of reconciliation. They want to punish the South." And Lincoln smiled sadly at his wife. He did love her, but she did have a habit of saying very tough things to him. And he, again, the sad smile, and he said, "Enemies, enemies, we must never use that word again." And that sums up for me Abraham Lincoln's role in the Civil War.
I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I have read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His truth is marching on.
So as we come to the very end of the program here, what do you think is left to be done in terms of research in this field now that you've had this really exceptional opportunity to dig deep into the causes of the Civil War? Do you want to do this again? Do you still have unanswered questions?
Yes, there are. There is another book that I've been thinking of writing about the huge antagonism between the abolitionists during the war, between the abolitionists and the Union generals like Grant and General Sherman. There was a war within the Civil War that I think most people don't realize went on. And then there was even a moment during the Civil War when the Midwestern states had a conspiracy to secede from the Union and form a separate confederacy and call for immediate peace. There's a lot of stuff out there that we could explore, and I think I hope to do it, God willing.
Well, I certainly do wish you well on those future projects. And I'd like to think that this Civil War study will help us here in the 21st century as we try to understand the social, political, and economic forces that drive us. And if you'll forgive the momentary moralization here, I think this gets to the very heart of our civic responsibility as individuals, because if we're not careful, the wrong concoction of religion and politics and social movements can cause us, even here today in the 21st century, to fall victim to another disease in the public mind. But ultimately, I leave the final verdict to you, because we have fallen victim to the passage of time, and we're done. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you heard here today, you can find us online at politicsandpatriotism.com, where we have more author interviews like this, plus a number of discussions on other civic subjects that you may also find just as stimulating. So you can click on the RSS feed at the top of our main page to download any of our past episodes for free, or a quick visit to the iTunes store will also get you any of our past episodes for free. Or if you stop by Stitcher.com, thanks to the very nice people at the Stitcher Smart Radio Network who distribute this program for us, you can download any of their free apps which will allow you to listen to us through your Apple smartphone or your Android device or your tablet, wherever you might be on this green earth. So on behalf of everyone here at the show, thank you for your time and have a good day.